Okay, so hello everyone, and thanks for joining. Sorry for the small delay. My name is Chris, and I'm a solution architect at Amazon. And today we'll be covering SP API best practices that could help you make better use of your APIs and boost your usage efficiency. So let's take a quick look at what we have prepared for you today. We'll be discussing the token bucket algorithm and SP API usage plans. We'll be also covering how to abide by these plans by relying on rate limiters, batch operations, and event-based architecture, and of course some monitoring. These topics will be gone over one after the other, explaining them and discussing how they can be used to make the APIs more efficient. After that, we'll hand over the mic to our representative from 3P Seller to tell us more about their migration journey. And finally, we'll be doing some Q&As. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll make sure to bring them up in the end of the presentation. And questions that were not answered or we didn't have time to answer, we will be following up after this session with follow-up emails to answer all of the questions. But yeah, if you can type them in the question box, it would be better so that we can track them, not in the chat box. Perfect. Now, without further ado, we'll jump right into it. And I'm guessing most of us on this call understand that the rate limit is how we manage APIs. We use it to limit the number of requests performed over a certain period of time in order to save resources and also to protect it from abuse. So we are basically monitoring incoming requests and ensuring that they don't violate a certain threshold. One example would be if you want to allow only 60 calls to be made in a time frame of 1 minute window. So what we are trying to do in general is we are trying to control the traffic. And one way of doing so is by relying on the famous token bucket algorithm. It comes to play in it's one way of measuring and controlling traffic. So basically, the token bucket algorithm is an analogy of fixed capacity bucket into which tokens are added at a fixed rate. Before allowing an API to proceed, the bucket is inspected to see if it contains at least one token at that time. If so, one token is removed from the bucket and the API is allowed to proceed. If we look in the bucket and there are no tokens inside, then the API the request is returned and saying the quota has exceeded during that window. Now tokens are automatically added to this bucket at a fixed rate, and if the bucket's capacity is reached, then no more tokens are added. And throttling again occurs when a request is made, but then we look into the bucket and there are no tokens there. Now, how does this algorithm come to play with SP API? All SP API operations have their own rate limits or usage plans, and they are defined by two main values, the rate and the burst. Going back to the token bucket algorithm, the burst is the bucket's capacity, or how many tokens there can be in one bucket, and then the rate is the frequency in which tokens are added to this bucket. It's also known as the request per second. Now, if you're making calls continuously over a long period of time, staying below this rate will help you avoid any throttle requests. Will help you avoid throttle requests or any throttling errors that are occurring. And again, like throttling occurs when we are trying to make a request and we look inside the bucket and no tokens are there, so there's nothing to proceed with. Getting back to usage plans, most ASP APIs are governed by standard usage plans, in which rates are static across callers. They are equal for all selling partners. And you can find these usage plans and the limits in our documentation page for API references under each API section. There's also another type of usage plan, which is a dynamic usage plan. And currently, it's only available for orders API only. Yeah, so what it does, the rate limits are adjusted to each selling partner based on their business needs. So it really depends on the size and type of the business. Common misclarification, just for further clarification, actually, rates will not dynamically increase based on the amount of traffic or the amount of requests that are made. So it's not like the more requests you have, the higher the rate. It's solely based on on business metrics and selling partner business metrics. Perfect. Now let's move on to rate limiters and retries. It's always important when architecting your application to keep rate limits in mind. Excessive API throttling can result in many problems, such as job failures, delays, and of course, ultimately, it can cost your organization time and money. These limits are rate limiters are basically a limit that is applied on the number of requests that's allowed over a certain period of time. And it's basically used to manage a high volume of traffic, allowing n requests per second based on the API resource limits. Implementing rate limiters allows the pattern to be smooth and consistent over time instead of having peaks throughout the traffic. Let me share with you here a blog post that we have regarding implementing rate limits. So if this is our developer documentation, and if you go to the blog section, here we have a list of blogs. Okay, correct. So here is the list of featured blogs that we have. We are constantly adding new blogs to this section. And if you go to the last blog here, there are strategies to optimize rate limits for your application workloads. And here you can find more information about rate limits and more detailed stuff there. And also we have like a sample snippet code on how to implement like a rate limiter. And here you can find an example configuration of a rate limiter. You can find it here, so I would definitely recommend checking this out, and if not implemented, try to implement it. Okay, so that's regarding rate limits and rate limiters. If we go back and see, it's important to keep in mind that the throttling requests are not wrong requests. They were just sent at the wrong period of time. You can always retry sending the same request after a certain period of time, and it can make it through. So there are techniques to actually implement this retry mechanism, and to avoid impacting your workloads, you should proactively implement these retry techniques. There are a bunch of techniques, but we will share with you the exponential backoff technique, which is a common strategy for handling retries of failed network calls. So in simpler terms, the clients wait progressively longer intervals between consecutive retries. So instead of retrying after every 5 seconds, you can retry every 5 seconds. And if it fails again, retry after 10 seconds. And it fails again after 15, and you move on exponentially. Now this is good, but there's a problem because in this approach, clients are waiting longer, and the requests that are being sent are still done in a synchronous way. So in order to break this synchronous waiting time, adding jitter provides a way to break this synchronization across the clients, and thus avoiding any possible collision between requests. And to do what jitter does is we add a randomness to the wait intervals. So we add plus random interval minus random interval, and this is used just to break the synchronization between the requests. And yeah, this random interval gives some sort of random factor in this process. So if you are trying to retry all requests at the same time, it's gonna turn out to be ineffective. And to avoid this problem, jitter can help you. And it's also always important to define max waiting time and the maximum number of retries. Next on the list are event-based architecture. Most times, polling models lead to higher number of requests, sometimes not needed, and can result in throttling errors. And by relying on event-based architecture, you can react to messages and events from upstream systems, and thus optimizing the call pattern and your resource usage. And we're lucky enough that we have a notifications API on our end that lets you subscribe to notifications that are relevant to a selling partner's business or a specific use case. You can create a destination and receive notifications and subscribe to notifications. Now, this is implemented, this is all backed by Amazon SQS and Amazon Event Bridge. So yeah, instead of polling for information, your application can receive it directly from Amazon when event is triggered and when event is triggered. So whenever you receive any certain event, then the notification is triggered, and then you can proceed with your work. There are many use cases for that. There's the order management use case, there's listing management fulfilled by Amazon FBA, and there are a bunch of others. I'd be more than happy to walk you through the documentation, but let me just discuss a bit some notification types. So one type, you can have the order status change notification. This notifies you when there is a new order or when there is an update on existing order. So instead of constantly checking if there's an update to your order, you can just receive one notification and then perform your related action. There's also a similar notification for reports and report processing. So there's a notification that notifies you when a report is finished or done processing, so you can then directly go and request it when it's ready. Same for product type definition changes. There are a lot of questions that we have regarding product schema and when are they updated, how they are updated, is there any new schema. So subscribing to the product type definition change can help you always stay up to date with new product types and or new product schema updates. So actually in the documentation, let's go to the main page here. In the documentation, you can go to the notifications use case. Here it is, notification API use case guide. And here there's you can find more information about what is notifications API and how to use it. Also some terminology about SQS and Event Bridge. And if you scroll down, you can find a tutorial here on how to implement notifications, how to set them up and use them. It's like a step-by-step guide that includes almost everything. I also recommend that you check it out. I know some of you might be concerned regarding creating or setting up your AWS account for this because it might be a bit hectic getting the configurations ready, but you already have a quick start tool that you can always rely on. It can automatically get you your credentials and set up your account for you within minutes. So it's definitely worth the look. And if you scroll down actually to the bottom, there's the notification type section. Here you can find various different notifications and what they do and what they are used for. And we are always adding new notification types here. So yeah, this is related to event-based architecture. Let's move on to batch functionality. Batch is another method for optimizing requests. It helps you reduce the number of calls needed to transmit data. So instead of sending one request every time, you can group them all together and then send them all in one request, in a batch request. Some of you might be wondering, okay, if we are sending 20 requests and 2 of them failed, will the whole batch fail? No, the answer is no. If we are sending 20 requests, 18 make it through, 2 do not. We get an error status in this saying that, okay, these 2 did not make it through. And yeah, so one example would be, for example, okay, you want to, yes, so if you want to make a request to get the lowest price offers for, let's say, 20 ASINs or 20 ASINs, and the operation can only get data for 18 of these ASINs, then the operation returns the results for these 18 instead of failing the whole request or the whole batch request. The operation also indicates that the remaining 2 ASINs failed, and it returns a status attribute that indicates whether or not data can be returned for this specific product identifier. And there are a bunch of batch functionality for a lot of different APIs, such as the catalog items, the product pricing, fees, product fees, orders, reports, and of course feeds. um, feeds. Yeah, and you relying on batch operations can help you decrease number of calls that you are using and reduce your infrastructure costs. And also, of course, reducing throttling errors. And you also have a blog post that that describes feeds, that describes batch operations. And here it is. If you go also to our featured blog posts, you can find reducing API calls with batch functionality. Here you can find detailed information about batch operations, how they are used. Here different APIs that you can use them for. And also, for example, the catalogs items API, you can find more information there about that, the usage plan, rates and the burst limits, also for pricing and a bunch more. Also, if you want to get some more information regarding the batch operations, you can always rely on we have a video that explains this in details. It goes over batch operations, and also it provides a demo of these operations in Postman. So yes, moving forward. Another best practice here is to implement monitoring and request tracking within your system. You can implement API dashboard to monitor your API activity against your rate limit. And monitoring is actually quite critical to ensure that you are meeting availability requirements. You can use the rate limit response. You can also you can rely on if you are using, of course, AWS services. You can always monitor API activity with Amazon CloudWatch metrics. You can set up alarms in your system. You can set up alarms in your system to trigger suspicious actions such as multiple unauthorized calls, unexpected request rates, random data volume. So yeah, monitoring and setting up alarms in your information in your system can help you prevent some further problems. And also in our APIs, we provide a response attribute, response header, which is the X Amazon rate limit, and it actually provides the current rate limits for the SP API operation. Now, keep in mind, this is returned on a best effort basis for all HTTP 200s, 400, and 404. Which means that they are not returned on every API request, but every once in a while, and you don't need them on every request, so you just need to get this data and use it to configure your monitoring dashboard or system. Yes. Now I would be more than happy to hand over the mic to Mr. Edward Timmons. He's founder at 3pseller.com. He will be sharing their migration journey and their overall experience at 3pseller with SP API.
Okay, great. Well, Chris, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Ed Timmons. Our application is called 3pseller.com. It provides a complete integration and offers sales reporting, replenishment insights, product performance, notifications, and analytics. We try to pull as many data points from Amazon sources as we can to give our customers better insight into the entire performance on Amazon as a seller. We focus on SMBs mainly, in particular manufacturing. We also appeal to agencies who manage multiple Amazon accounts. We're a fairly small team. We have about 3 to 5 people total. We call Orders API frequently to keep the data live. We also use the Pricing API on a daily basis. We usually pull all the inventory reports on an hourly basis just to keep everything fresh. Before we started the migration, we already had a little bit of experience on beta testing, so it was pretty easy as far as walking through the documentation and getting set up. It has been a process. We had to read and understand everything. We started the app setup by integrating with AWS, and then after that, we worked on authentication for the accounts. After we were in hybrid mode, we utilized the authentication service to grab the authorization through the MWS. This way, we were able to migrate all the accounts using the authentication service. The only hangup we had was that we did not understand from the documentation that the app had to be published before we could use that particular service. We were not sure if the issue was because of a coding error or just another stage that required approval. After we got authentication set up, the next step was getting an SP API refresh token. We used the refresh token to get an authentication token, and then we could successfully call the SP API in production alongside with MWS. That was the groundwork we laid down. After that, we analyzed all our MWS calls. Then, taking a one-by-one approach, we migrated all calls to SP API. Our approach to the migration was breaking it into small chunks and going call by call. We found that this approach sped things up pretty well. I think the big thing is breaking down the process into small chunks and having your migration running alongside. I did not really worry about the users being able to authenticate. We had the authentication API, so we could obtain an authorization through that, and we did not have to have our customers reauthorize our application, which was a good thing. With authorization set up and SP API working in production, we first migrated all the calls and then at last worked on the interface for users to re-authenticate our app. I think with the SP API, the new framework, the new way of doing things, that is the way forward. One of the benefits of SP API is the fact that it is so much easier to develop with. It is a huge benefit to be moving from the XML to the JSON API. It's so much easier to work with. I've been enjoying the benefits of running SP API, like having access to the vendor data is a huge one, and having more push notifications. So we don't have to constantly query the APIs. That's a huge benefit. A big change is that customers do not have to wait for the data. For example, in contrast with reports, where the sellers can only get the data once an hour, with the push notifications, they can get it immediately. There are all kinds of benefits to the new architecture, and I'm really excited for them. It's like a breath of fresh air to see regular updates and constant progress on the new APIs. We're getting more frequent updates, kind of like with the advertising API, you get monthly updates, improvements constantly, and that is a great thing. I love the way Amazon is communicating and putting updates even on GitHub, and I do get responses there from the SP API team and many other developers. I think the frequency of the updates will continue even faster when MWS is sunsetted. And as a longtime developer, over 10, 15 years now, I'm really happy with the changes. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, team.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Ed. Again, Ed's actually one of the first migrators, and thank you so much for sharing. Now, moving on to the last section of our session today regarding questions. Now, we received a couple of questions in the chat. I won't be able to cover them all, but for sure we'll be reaching out after that by email to support you with all questions there. Also, feel free to reach out to your managed AM, your AMs that are managing you, or the SAs, and with any questions later. So first question, the request that I tried returned 2 in X Amazon rate limit header, but I'm not sure what does it mean. Is it 2 requests per second? Where can I find information on the standard plan for different types of API calls? The rate limit header parameter represents the remaining number of requests per second. So the default request per second can always be seen in the API reference page for all APIs and operations. So like I showed here, let me just share again, just to make sure. As we go here, let's choose any API operation. Let's say orders. We go to the orders section, the reference, and then we scroll down, and you can see here the usage plan. So the rate, request per second, and then the burst. Once the developer starts calling an operation, the header parameter will decrease until new tokens are added to the bucket. So yeah, you can always find more information about usage plan here, or you can check them also in the blog section that I shared previously. Next question is also related to rate limits. Will rate limits change? If yes, how often will the usage plan change? If we could raise the rate limits technically at any time, but if we ever lower the rate limits, because I guess most of you are concerned about that, if we are lowering rate limits, If we ever lower the rate limits posted in the API reference documentation, we will communicate the change in advance to give you time to update and test your applications before the change go live. But in general, this is rarely the case. And regarding dynamic usage plans, the rate limits will be adjusted automatically depending on your business context. Not on your traffic. Not the more requests you make, the higher the usage plan. But yeah, it depends on your business context. Perfect. Next question is, can my application completely avoid getting throttled? No, any number of there are a bunch of factors outside your control that could result in a small number of 429s or throttling errors. This is expected, but you should always encounter you should always be accounted for in your application code. Make sure they are handling everything correctly by implementing retries that I previously shared, or even monitoring your dashboard. So there are a lot of implementations that you can do to try to avoid, but also, of course, there are some factors that you could not control. Next on the list is, how can I test my application with respect to its usage plans? It's a good question, but you can always test the 429 error handlings using SPA API sandbox tool. However, you cannot test the rate limits with sandbox. So you can test that you are handling the rate limits in a correct way, but you cannot actually check the rate limits. This is because while operations are in production, they can have various rates, and specifically in sandbox, all operations have the same rate. But you can always see your assigned usage rate in the rate limit response header for each operation when available. But again, this response header is not returned on every occasion, but it's not on every call that you receive this response header. So I guess this would be all for the questions. There are a bunch of other questions that we will not be able to answer right now, but we will make sure to we collected them, and we will make sure to reply after this call by email, sending you everything there. Also, again, feel free to reach out to any of us regarding any questions for SPA API, either questions about the webinar itself or any questions in general that fall under this umbrella. And I hope you enjoyed this webinar. And yep, thank you guys for joining.